The taste of Earl Grey had grown bitter on my tongue, though I'd only taken one sip. I set the china cup down with deliberate care, the soft clink against the saucer the only sound in my kitchen. At 62, I'd learned that silence often spoke louder than words, especially when those words threatened to burn bridges I wasn't quite ready to torch. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Mom, you look like you've seen a ghost. Alan's voice carried that patronizing tone I'd grown to recognize over the past 5 years, ever since he'd married Cynthia. My son, my 40-year-old son who still called me when he couldn't figure out his taxes, stood in my doorway wearing his Sunday best and that practiced smile he reserved for difficult conversations. I studied his face, searching for traces of the boy who used to climb into my lap when thunderstorms rattled our old farmhouse windows. The boy who promised he'd always take care of me when his father died. That boy had grown into a man who now stood before me with documents in his hand and his wife's poison in his ear. "I'm fine, sweetheart." The endearment felt like sandpaper against my throat. "Just enjoying my morning tea." Cynthia appeared behind him, her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. She wore that expression I'd come to know well, the one that suggested I was a burden she'd learned to tolerate for Alan's sake. At 35, she possessed the kind of calculated beauty that required maintenance and admiration in equal measure. What she lacked in genuine warmth, she compensated for with an impressive ability to manipulate my son's guilt. "We brought the papers," she announced, her voice artificially bright. "Alan worked so hard to get everything transferred properly. The lake house is officially yours now, Judith. Just like you always wanted. The lake house. Our family's sanctuary for 3 generations, where my husband had taught Alan to fish, where I'd hosted countless summer gatherings, where I'd imagined spending my remaining years watching grandchildren, if I ever had any. Learned to swim in the same crystal waters that had once reflected my own mother's laugh." Alan stepped forward, pride radiating from every gesture as he placed the manila envelope on my kitchen table. "I kept my promise, Mom. The house is in your name now. You can retire there, enjoy the peace and quiet. Maybe take up painting again, like you always talked about." I picked up the envelope with steady hands, though my heart hammered against my ribs. The weight felt wrong. Too light for legal documents, too substantial for the lies I suspected it contained. Through the kitchen window, autumn sunlight filtered through the maple tree Alan's father had planted the year our son was born. The leaves had begun their descent, carpeting the ground in shades of amber and rust. "That's very thoughtful of you both." I opened the envelope slowly, buying time to school my expression. The papers inside looked official enough, complete with notary stamps and legal letterhead. But I'd learned long ago not to trust appearances, especially where Cynthia was concerned. "We thought you might want to drive up there this weekend," Cynthia suggested, perching on the edge of my kitchen chair with the grace of a woman who'd never worked a day in her life. "See how everything looks after the winter maintenance Alan arranged?" Something cold settled in my stomach. "That's a lovely idea. In fact, I think I'll drive up today." Alan's smile faltered slightly. "Today? But we were hoping—" "I'm 62, not 92, I interrupted gently. "I'm perfectly capable of making a 3-hour drive to see my own property." The look that passed between them lasted less than a second, but I caught it. Cynthia's perfectly manicured fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her clutch purse. Alan ran his hand through his hair, a tell he'd inherited from his father, one that emerged whenever he felt cornered. "Of course you are," Cynthia recovered smoothly. "We just thought you might want company. The roads can be tricky this time of year." I stood, smoothing down my pink cardigan with movements I hoped appeared casual. "I appreciate the concern, but I prefer to see it alone first. Get reacquainted with the place, you know? Besides, I'm sure you both have more important things to do with your Saturday." The silence that followed felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. I could practically hear the wheels turning in Cynthia's calculating mind, could see Alan struggling between his desire to protest and his ingrained respect for my independence. "Well," Alan finally said, "just call when you get there safely, okay?" "Of course, darling." They left with more hugs and promises than usual, Cynthia's perfume lingering in my kitchen long after her rental car disappeared down the street. I stood at the window, watching until I was certain they were gone, then returned to the table where the envelope lay open like a wound. The drive north took exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes. I'd made this journey hundreds of times over the decades, but today felt different. Today, I was driving toward either the fulfillment of a long-held dream or the confirmation of my worst suspicions about the woman who'd stolen my son's spine along with his heart. The lake house sat nestled among towering pines on the eastern shore of Mirror Lake, its cedar siding weathered to a warm silver that had always reminded me of driftwood. My grandfather had built the original cabin in 1953. My husband and I had expanded it during the early years of our marriage. Every board, every stone of the fireplace, every window frame held memories I could recite like prayers. But as I turned into the familiar gravel driveway, those memories collided with an impossible reality. A late-model SUV sat parked where my car should be. Children's toys scattered the front yard I'd once kept meticulously maintained. Smoke curled from the chimney I'd expected to light myself for the first time as the house's sole owner. I sat in my car for a full minute, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to process what I was seeing. Then I walked to the front door, my front door, and knocked. A woman in her 30s answered, a toddler balanced on her hip and confusion written across her pleasant face. "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to bother you," I managed, my voice remarkably steady. "I think there might be some mistake. This is my house." Her confusion deepened. "Your house? Ma'am, we've been renting this place for 8 months. We have a lease agreement with the property management company." 8 months. The same time frame during which Alan had been promising to transfer the deed, assuring me monthly that the legal process was almost complete. "May I ask who you're renting from?" She called over her shoulder, and a man appeared, presumably her husband. After a brief whispered conversation, he produced a folder from a kitchen drawer. "Lakeside Property Management," he said, showing me the letterhead. "We're paid up through next summer. Is there some kind of problem?" I accepted the papers he offered, scanning the details with growing horror. The lease was legitimate, legally binding, and signed by someone representing the property owner. Someone who had used forged documents to gain legal control of a house that should have been mine. "Thank you," I said quietly, handing back their lease. "I'm sorry to have disturbed you. I think I need to make some phone calls." The drive home passed in a blur of autumn landscape and mounting rage. Not the hot, explosive anger I might have felt in my younger years, but something cooler and more dangerous. The kind of fury that calculates instead of combusts. I called Alan before I'd even reached my own driveway. "Mom, how's the house? Did you—" "Alan." My voice cut through his enthusiasm like a blade. "There are people living in the lake house, a family with a legal lease." The silence stretched so long I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, "That's impossible. I handled everything myself. I have the papers." "So do I. And they're worthless. Someone sold the house, Alan. Someone forged documents and took the money." I could hear him breathing, could almost feel his world shifting on its axis the way mine had shifted an hour earlier. "I need to see you," I continued. "Both of you. Tonight." "Mom, I'm sure there's an explanation." "Yes," I agreed. "I'm sure there is." I ended the call and sat in my driveway as darkness crept across the neighborhood. Through my kitchen window, I could see the table where they'd presented me with their lies that morning. Could imagine Cynthia sitting there with her perfect smile and her poisonous intentions. My phone buzzed with a text from Alan. "Can we come over tomorrow instead? Cynthia's not feeling well." I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Tonight, 8 o'clock. This isn't a request. The waiting was the hardest part. I made dinner I couldn't eat, tried to read a book I couldn't focus on, and rehearsed conversations I wasn't sure I'd have the strength to finish. By the time their headlights swept across my front yard, I'd settled into the kind of calm that comes after acceptance, the peaceful eye of a storm that hasn't yet broken. They arrived together, Alan looking haggard and Cynthia wearing an expression of wounded innocence I recognized from every family gathering where her behavior had been questioned. She'd perfected the art of playing victim while orchestrating chaos. "Judith," she began before they'd even crossed my threshold. I hope you don't think we had anything to do with— Sit down. I gestured toward my living room, my voice carrying an authority I hadn't used since Alan was a teenager. Both of you. We arranged ourselves like opposing armies. Them on the sofa and me in my husband's old recliner. The distance felt appropriate, given what I'd discovered. I spoke with the property management company, I began without preamble. The house was sold 9 months ago to an investment group. The sale was handled by someone claiming to represent the family estate, complete with power of attorney documents. Alan's face had gone white. That's impossible. I've been working with the lawyers for over a year to get the transfer completed. The paperwork you saw this morning is expertly forged. I reached for the manila envelope they'd brought, pulling out the documents I'd spent the afternoon studying. The notary stamp is real, but the seal number doesn't match county records. The lawyer's signature is close, but the letterhead has a subtle difference in the logo that someone who'd never done business with that firm might miss. The color drained from Cynthia's face, but she rallied quickly. This is absurd. Are you accusing us of— I'm not accusing Alan of anything. The emphasis on my son's name hung in the air like a blade. But someone with access to family documents, someone who understood the legal process and had months to plan, someone who needed money badly enough to steal from their own family. That someone sold our lake house and kept the proceeds. Alan turned to look at his wife, and I watched understanding dawn across his features like sunrise over devastated landscape. Cynthia, tell me you didn't— Don't be ridiculous. But her voice lacked its usual conviction, and her hands trembled as she reached for her purse. Judith's just confused. She's getting older, and sometimes— I called the bank, I interrupted quietly. The account where you've been depositing Alan's paychecks for the past year? It shows a deposit of $237,000 8 months ago, the same week the house was sold. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the furnace cycling on in the basement. Alan stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time, while Cynthia's carefully constructed facade finally began to crumble. You don't understand, she whispered. I have debts. Credit cards, medical bills from before we married. I was going to pay it back. I was going to— Buy what? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Alan found his voice. The jewelry, the car, the renovations to our house. He was speaking to himself more than to us. Pieces of a puzzle falling into place with sickening clarity. You said your grandmother left you money. She did. She left me some money, but not enough, and the creditors were threatening to— So you stole my mother's house. Alan's voice was flat, emotionless. You stole her home and let me believe I was giving it to her as a gift. I watched my son's world implode with a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. This was what I'd been waiting for. The moment when his carefully preserved illusions finally shattered against reality. Cynthia was crying now, mascara tracking down her cheeks in dark rivulets. I was going to fix it. I had a plan to buy it back, to make everything right. I just needed time. Time? I stood slowly, every joint protesting the movement. Time to what? Watch me drive up there every weekend thinking I was visiting my own property? Time to let me plan my retirement around a house that was already gone? She looked up at me then, and I saw something dangerous flicker in her eyes. The wounded victim act was failing, and underneath it lived the predator I'd always suspected. You never liked me anyway, she said, her voice turning bitter. Nothing I did was ever good enough for you. I gave Alan a life you never could, took care of him in ways you never— Cynthia. Alan's voice cut through her words like a whip. Stop talking. Just stop. But she couldn't stop. The mask was off now, and the poison was finally flowing freely. She's had everything handed to her, Cynthia continued, turning to Alan with desperate intensity. The house, the life insurance money, her pension. Why shouldn't someone who actually needs help get some of it? I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Because it wasn't yours to take. Nothing's ever yours until you take it. The words hung in the air like a confession, revealing more about Cynthia's worldview than years of careful observation had managed to uncover. Alan was staring at his wife as if she'd grown horns. Jesus Christ, Cynthia, what have you done? What indeed? As I stood in my living room, watching my son's marriage disintegrate and my own life's work reduced to ashes, I realized that the question wasn't what she had done. It was what I was going to do about it. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken consequences, and the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of winter's approach. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw my husband's eyes staring back at me from a face carved hollow by betrayal. In that moment, I made a choice that would change everything. Get out. The words fell from my lips with the finality of a judge's gavel. Alan's head snapped up, his face a mask of confusion and dawning horror. Mom, please, let me fix this. I'll find a way to— I said get out. I remained standing, my hands steady despite the earthquake happening beneath my ribs. Both of you. Cynthia had stopped crying, her tear-streaked face now calculating as she sensed the shift in power. Judith, you're being dramatic. We can work through this as a family. Family? The word tasted like ash. You sold my family's heritage for your shopping addiction and gambling debts. You made my son complicit in theft. You are not my family. Alan stood slowly, his movements those of a man who'd aged decades in the span of an hour. Mom, I didn't know. You have to believe me. I studied his face, the same earnest expression he'd worn as a boy when he'd broken something precious and was desperately trying to make it right. The difference was that broken lamps could be replaced. Broken trust, broken dreams, broken hearts. Those required different kinds of repair. I believe you didn't know, I said quietly. But that doesn't change what's been done. I'll make this right. I'll sell our house, take out loans, whatever it takes to get your lake house back. Cynthia's mask slipped again. Alan, be reasonable. We can't just— Shut up. His voice carried a venom I'd never heard before. Just shut up, Cynthia. I watched this exchange with growing clarity. My son was finally seeing his wife for what she was, but the revelation had come at too high a price. The lake house was gone. Even if he somehow managed to buy it back, it would never again be the sanctuary I'd envisioned for my remaining years. The trust between us was damaged, perhaps irreparably. You have 24 hours to remove your belongings from my house, I said, my voice cutting through their whispered argument. Alan's head jerked up. What? Your key, your garage code, your emergency contact status at my bank and doctor's office. All of it ends now. Mom, you're upset. I understand, but you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. I walked to the front hall and opened the door. Cool evening air rushing in to displace the poison they'd brought into my home. 24 hours. Cynthia was the first to move, her heels clicking against my hardwood floors as she gathered her purse and coat. She paused at the threshold, and for a moment I thought she might attempt another manipulation. Instead, she simply said, "You'll regret this. When you're old and alone, you'll remember this moment." "I'm already old," I replied. "And I've been alone since the day you convinced my son to stop calling me unless he needed something." She flinched as if I'd struck her, then stalked toward their car. Alan lingered in my doorway, his face a portrait of devastation. "I love you, Mom. That has to count for something." The words hit harder than Cynthia's threats ever could. Because I loved him too. Loved him enough to recognize that our relationship had become toxic, built on his guilt and my loneliness rather than genuine affection. "Love isn't enough," I said gently. "Not anymore." I closed the door before he could respond, then stood in my empty foyer listening to their muffled voices through the walls. Their argument grew heated, Alan's bewildered anger clashing against Cynthia's defensive fury. I heard car doors slam, an engine start, and finally silence. The house felt different in their absence. Cleaner somehow, as if their departure had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I walked through each room, touching familiar objects and rediscovering spaces that felt truly mine for the first time in years. In the kitchen, I found myself staring at the table where they'd presented their forgeries that morning. Had it really been only 12 hours since I'd trusted my son enough to believe his promises? The betrayal felt both fresh and ancient, like a wound that had been festering undetected for years. My phone rang. Alan, of course. "Mom, please, can we talk about this like adults?" "We did talk about it. The conversation is over." You can't just cut me out of your life over something Cynthia did. I settled into my husband's chair, the worn leather molding to my body like an embrace. I'm not cutting you out, Alan. I'm protecting myself. From what? From you. The words hung between us like a chasm. From the man you've become since you married her. From the son who stopped visiting unless he needed money or signatures. From the person who lets his wife steal from his mother and calls it love. His breathing was ragged through the phone. That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you called just to check on me? When did you last visit without an agenda? When did you stop being my son and start being her accomplice? The silence stretched until I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, I tried to do right by both of you. You tried to avoid conflict. There's a difference. So what now? You write me off? Pretend you never had a son? I closed my eyes, feeling every one of my 62 years settling into my bones. Now I learn to live without depending on anyone who's proven they can't be trusted. Mom. Good night, Alan. I ended the call and turned off the phone, then sat in the gathering darkness of my living room. Outside, streetlights flickered on, and my neighbors began their evening routines. Dogs being walked, children called in from play, the comfortable sounds of families functioning as they should. The next morning brought autumn rain and an unexpected visitor. I was sitting at my kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper when a knock interrupted my solitude. Through the peephole, I saw a woman I didn't immediately recognize. Mid-40s, graying brown hair, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Mrs. Larson? I'm Janet Peterson. I work at Lakeside Property Management. My stomach clenched, but I opened the door. Ms. Peterson, what can I do for you? May I come in? I think there's something you need to know about your property. I led her to the living room, noting how her eyes took in the family photos and personal touches that marked this as a home rather than a house. She seemed nervous, her hands fidgeting with a manila folder that looked depressingly familiar. I've been managing the lake house for the past 8 months, she began. When I heard you'd visited yesterday, I did some research into the sale records. And? The documents we were given don't match the county records. Not exactly anyway. There are discrepancies in the signatures, inconsistencies in the notarization. She opened her folder, spreading papers across my coffee table. I've been in this business for 15 years, and something about this transaction never felt right. Hope, dangerous, fragile hope, unfurled in my chest. What are you saying? I'm saying the sale might not be legally valid. If the documents were forged, if the power of attorney was falsified, then the current ownership could be challenged in court. I stared at the papers, afraid to believe what she was suggesting. What would that mean for the family currently living there? If the sale is voided, they'd be relocated and compensated for their moving expenses. They knew they were taking a risk with a below-market lease. Most legitimate properties in that area rent for twice what they're paying. Janet Peterson leaned forward, her expression earnest. Mrs. Larson, I specialize in property fraud cases. I've seen this pattern before. Family members or trusted individuals using forged documents to liquidate assets. If you're willing to pursue this legally, I think we can get your house back. The words washed over me like absolution. My house. Not lost forever. Not a sacrifice to Cynthia's greed, but recoverable through legal channels that would ensure justice was served. What would I need to do? First, we'd need to file a police report for fraud and theft. Then civil proceedings to void the sale. It won't be quick or cheap. But if you're serious about this, I thought of Alan's promise to make things right, of his offer to sell his own home to buy back what Cynthia had stolen. This path would make his sacrifice unnecessary while ensuring that Cynthia faced real consequences for her actions. I'm very serious, I said. Janet smiled for the first time since arriving. Good, because I've been hoping someone would challenge this sale since the day it crossed my desk. We spent the next 2 hours reviewing documentation and planning strategy. Janet's expertise became clear as she walked me through the legal process, explaining how property fraud cases worked and what evidence we'd need to prove our case. The beauty of this particular fraud, she explained, is that your daughter-in-law got greedy. If she'd sold for market value, it might have been harder to prove criminal intent. But she sold a $400,000 property for $237,000? That suggests she was in a hurry to liquidate and didn't care about maximizing value. She needed fast cash to pay off debts, I confirmed. Exactly. And that desperation led to sloppy work on the forgeries. A more careful criminal might have gotten away with this. After Janet left, I sat in my kitchen with her business card and a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about recovering property. It was about justice, about consequences, about ensuring that people who stole from their families face the full weight of their actions. My phone buzzed with a text from Alan. "Please call me. We need to talk." I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Whatever conversation he wanted to have would wait until I'd secured my own future, until I'd proven that I was nobody's victim. The rain continued through the afternoon, drumming against my windows with a rhythm that felt almost celebratory. For the first time in months, I had something to look forward to that didn't depend on my son's promises or his wife's cooperation. I had justice. And justice, I was beginning to understand, was a dish best served with excellent legal counsel and irrefutable evidence. The police station smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant. Detective Maria Santos looked younger than my son, but her eyes held the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much human cruelty too early in life. She listened to my story without interruption, occasionally making notes in a file that seemed impossibly thin for something that had destroyed my trust in family. "Property fraud cases are tricky," she said when I finished, "especially when they involve family members. Are you certain you want to pursue criminal charges against your daughter-in-law?" "I'm certain." The words came out steadier than I felt. She stole from me. The fact that she's married to my son doesn't change that. Detective Santos nodded, but I caught something in her expression. Pity, perhaps, or recognition of a pain she'd witnessed before. "I have to ask, what's your relationship like with your son? Is there any possibility he was involved in the fraud?" The question hit like a physical blow, even though I'd been asking myself the same thing for days. "I don't think so, but I'm not sure I trust my own judgment anymore." That's honest, and probably smart. She pulled out a digital recorder. "Let's start from the beginning. I need everything. Dates, conversations, financial records, anything that might help establish a timeline." For the next 2 hours, I dissected my relationship with Alan and Cynthia, searching for clues I might have missed. The detective's questions were gentle but relentless, forcing me to examine memories I'd preferred to leave unexamined. "Your son never questioned the delay in transferring the property?" Santos asked. "He said legal processes take time, that the lawyers were being thorough." I paused, remembering Alan's explanations. He seemed as frustrated by the delays as I was. Or he was a very good actor. The possibility hung between us like a poisonous cloud. I'd spent 3 days believing in Alan's innocence, but doubt was a patient predator, and it was beginning to feast on my certainty. "We'll start with the financial records," Santos said, closing her notebook. "Bank statements, the forged documents, anything related to the property sale. My partner and I will coordinate with your attorney. Ms. Peterson gave me her card, to make sure we're not stepping on each other's toes." I left the police station feeling simultaneously empowered and exhausted. The investigation was beginning, but justice, I was learning, was a marathon rather than a sprint. Janet Peterson had arranged for me to meet with Ernest Powell, an attorney who specialized in property fraud. His office occupied the top floor of a downtown building, all glass and steel and expensive furniture that whispered competence and success. "Mrs. Larson," he said, rising from behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip. "Janet's told me about your situation. I've reviewed the preliminary documentation, and I believe we have an excellent case." Chen was perhaps 50, with silver threading through black hair and the kind of confidence that came from winning battles in courtrooms. He spread documents across his conference table with the precision of a surgeon laying out instruments. "The forgeries are actually quite good," he said, almost admiringly, "but not perfect. The notary seal is authentic, but it was stolen from the notary's car 6 months before your house was sold. The signature on the power of attorney is close enough to fool a casual observer, but a handwriting expert will spot the differences immediately. How do you know all this already? I've been investigating similar cases for 15 years. Your daughter-in-law used a network that's been operating in this area for the past 3 years. They specialize in quick property liquidation for people with gambling debts or other financial pressures. The words hit me like ice water. Gambling debts? Chen nodded grimly. According to the bank records Janet obtained, your daughter-in-law has been making regular payments to 3 different online gambling sites. The pattern suggests someone with a serious addiction who was using stolen funds to chase losses. I sank into the leather chair across from his desk, feeling the last of my illusions crumble. This wasn't just about credit card debt or medical bills. Cynthia had gambled away my inheritance, my security, my dreams of peaceful retirement. She'd fed my family's legacy into slot machines and poker apps. There's more, Powell continued, his voice gentle. The investigation has uncovered other victims. Your daughter-in-law appears to have been working with this fraud ring for at least 18 months. You're not the first family member she's targeted. Other family members? Her previous husband's elderly father, a disabled cousin who trusted her with financial power of attorney. The pattern is consistent. She gains access to family assets through trust and marriage, then liquidates everything she can get her hands on. The room seemed to tilt around me. Alan hadn't just married a woman with financial problems. He'd married a predator who specialized in exploiting family trust, and I'd welcomed her into our lives, made excuses for her coldness, attributed her behavior to stress or misunderstanding. Mr. Powell, I said carefully, I need to know something. Is it possible my son was involved? Willingly, I mean. The attorney studied my face with practiced compassion. Based on what I've seen so far, I don't think so. Your son's financial records show consistent surprise at their improving finances. He believed the story about your daughter-in-law's grandmother leaving money. But Mrs. Larson, you should prepare yourself for the possibility that his innocence might not matter in court. What do you mean? If the prosecution can prove he benefited from the proceeds of the fraud, and he did, through home improvements and lifestyle upgrades, he could face charges as an accessory, even if he didn't know where the money came from. The thought of Alan in handcuffs, of my son facing criminal charges because of the woman he'd trusted, made my stomach lurch. But beneath the maternal horror, a colder voice reminded me that consequences were consequences, regardless of intention. What happens now? Now, we let the criminal investigation proceed while we prepare the civil case to recover your property. The beauty of this situation is that the current owners, the family renting your lake house, are actually cooperating with us. They want out of this mess as much as you want resolution. Chen walked me to the elevator, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture that felt grandfatherly despite our similar ages. Mrs. Larson, I want you to understand something. What your daughter-in-law did to you, it's not your fault. These people are professionals. They count on family loyalty and trust to protect them from scrutiny. The elevator doors closed on his words, but they echoed in my mind during the drive home. Professional. Cynthia wasn't just a selfish woman who'd made desperate choices. She was a criminal who'd studied our family dynamic and exploited our weaknesses with surgical precision. My house felt like a sanctuary when I finally walked through the front door. 3 days ago, it had been the place where I'd discovered betrayal. Now it was becoming my fortress, the place where I planned my counterattack. I made tea and settled into my husband's chair with the file of documents Powell had given me. Bank records, police reports, legal briefs. The paper trail of Cynthia's destruction read like a textbook on family exploitation. My phone had been buzzing intermittently all day. Texts from Alan that I hadn't opened, missed calls I hadn't returned. But as I read through the evidence of his wife's systematic theft, my resolve hardened. Whatever pain he was experiencing now was nothing compared to what he'd allowed me to suffer for months. I opened the first text. Mom, please. I'm going crazy not knowing if you're okay. The second, Cynthia's gone. Packed her things and left this morning. I think she knew this was coming. The third, I filed for divorce. I should have listened to you years ago. And the most recent, I love you. That has to count for something. I stared at that last message, feeling the familiar tug of maternal instinct warring with harder-won wisdom. Love did count for something, but it wasn't enough to erase the consequences of choices made and trust broken. Instead of responding to Alan, I called Detective Santos. Mrs. Larson? I was just about to call you. We've had a development. What kind of development? Your daughter-in-law tried to board a flight to Costa Rica this morning. Airport security flagged her passport. She's been added to a watch list pending the fraud investigation. She's currently in federal custody. I felt a sharp satisfaction that surprised me with its intensity. What does that mean for the case? It means she's scared. People who aren't guilty don't usually try to flee the country. Her attorney will probably want to plea bargain, which could speed up your property recovery significantly. After ending the call, I sat in the growing darkness of my living room and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. Cynthia was in custody. Alan had filed for divorce. The investigation was proceeding faster than anyone had expected. For the first time in years, I was exactly where I needed to be, not waiting for someone else to fix my problems or protect my interests, but actively pursuing justice for myself. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Alan. Can I come over? I need to explain. This time I replied, not yet. It wasn't cruelty that motivated my response, though I suspected Alan might interpret it that way. It was self-preservation. I was learning to trust my own judgment again, to value my own peace of mind over other people's comfort. The lesson had come at a terrible price, but it was mine now, and I intended to make the most of it. The courthouse steps felt steeper than they should have for a woman my age, but I climbed them with purpose, Janet Peterson at my side, and Ernest Powell's briefcase heavy with evidence in my other hand. 6 weeks had passed since Cynthia's arrest. 6 weeks of depositions and document reviews and sleepless nights spent wondering if I was strong enough to see this through to the end. Today would provide the answer. Remember, Powell murmured as we approached the entrance, this is just the plea hearing. The judge will review Cynthia's agreement and determine if the terms are acceptable. You don't have to say anything unless asked directly. But I wanted to say something. After weeks of letting lawyers and detectives speak for me, I wanted my voice to be heard in the room where justice would finally be served. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. All wood paneling and fluorescent lights that cast everything in harsh relief. Cynthia sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit that made her look younger and more vulnerable than the predator I now knew her to be. She didn't turn around when I entered, but I saw her shoulders tense at the sound of my footsteps. Alan was there too, sitting in the back row like a penitent seeking absolution in a church that no longer offered forgiveness. Our eyes met briefly, his filled with pleading, mine offering nothing in return. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elaine Williams. The judge was a woman in her 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who surveyed the courtroom with the authority of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from lies. She reviewed the paperwork with meticulous care before addressing Cynthia's attorney. Mr. Morgan, your client is prepared to accept the plea agreement as outlined? Yes, Your Honor. Mrs. Larson, the defendant, pleads guilty to grand theft, fraud, and identity theft. In exchange for her cooperation in recovering additional stolen assets and providing information about her co-conspirators, the prosecution recommends a sentence of 3 to 5 years with eligibility for parole after 18 months. 3 to 5 years. For stealing my home, my security, my trust and family. For gambling away 3 generations of memories and leaving me to discover the devastation on my own. It seemed both too little and exactly enough. Mrs. Larson, the judge said, and for a moment I thought she was addressing me before realizing she meant Cynthia. Do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor. Cynthia's voice was barely audible, stripped of the confident manipulation I'd grown to recognize. And do you understand that by accepting this plea, you're admitting guilt to these charges? Yes, Your Honor. Judge Williams turned to the prosecutor. What restitution has been arranged? The defendant has agreed to surrender all assets purchased with the proceeds of the theft. The victim's property, a lake house valued at $400,000, will be returned through civil proceedings already underway. Additionally, the defendant will pay restitution of $50,000 for emotional distress and legal fees. $50,000. a number that meant nothing to me beyond its symbolism. The money wouldn't restore what Cynthia had taken, trust couldn't be bought back, peace of mind had no price tag. But it represented acknowledgement, admission that her actions had consequences beyond mere inconvenience. "Mrs. Judith Larson," Judge Williams said, looking directly at me, "as the victim in this case, you have the right to make a statement before sentencing. Would you like to address the court?" Chen touched my arm gently, a reminder that I didn't have to speak. But I'd found my voice over these past weeks, and I intended to use it. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of every person in the courtroom watching me. Cynthia finally turned around, her face pale and drawn, mascara smudged beneath eyes that held no trace of the confident woman who'd sat at my kitchen table 6 weeks ago. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. 6 weeks ago, I thought I was gaining the home of my dreams. Instead, I discovered that someone I'd welcomed into my family had been systematically stealing from me for months. I paused, gathering thoughts I'd rehearsed but never spoken aloud. Cynthia didn't just steal my property. She stole my peace of mind, my trust in my own judgment, my ability to believe that family meant something sacred. She made me question whether my son was complicit in my exploitation. She turned what should have been the foundation of my retirement into a source of fear and shame. Cynthia was crying now, tears streaming down her face in rivers of ruined makeup, but I wasn't finished. What hurts most isn't the money, or even the property. It's the time I lost. Time I spent doubting myself, wondering if I was being unreasonable or paranoid when I questioned her behavior. Time I spent making excuses for someone who was planning my destruction while smiling at my dinner table. I looked directly at Cynthia, holding her gaze until she looked away. "You didn't just steal from me. You stole from every elderly person who will now doubt their family's motives. You stole from every parent who will wonder if their child's spouse can be trusted. You made the world a little more dangerous for people like me." The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of Cynthia's sobbing. I wasn't finished, but I took a moment to breathe, to center myself for the words that mattered most. "Your Honor, I want the court to understand that this wasn't a crime of desperation or a single bad decision. This was a calculated campaign of exploitation by someone who studies vulnerable people and systematically destroys their security. The plea agreement is acceptable to me not because it's proportional to the harm she caused, but because it removes her from society long enough to protect other families from the same devastation." I sat down to absolute silence. Judge Williams made notes for several minutes before addressing the courtroom again. "Mrs. Cynthia Larson, what you did to your victim represents one of the most insidious forms of theft. Betrayal of family trust. You didn't steal from a stranger. You stole from someone who welcomed you into their home and treated you as a daughter. The court accepts your plea agreement, but I want to be clear about something." The judge leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "If you violate the terms of this agreement in any way, if you fail to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation, if you attempt to contact the victim or her family members, you will serve the maximum sentence allowed by law. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." "The court sentences you to 4 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 2 years, contingent on full restitution and continued cooperation with law enforcement. 4 years. 2 until possible parole." It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that actions had consequences, that family trust carried weight in the eyes of the law. As the bailiff led Cynthia away, she turned once more to look at me. I saw something desperate in her eyes, perhaps an appeal for forgiveness, maybe just the recognition that she'd finally been held accountable. I offered neither comfort nor condemnation. I simply watched her disappear through the door that would separate her from society for the next several years. Alan approached me as the courtroom emptied, his face ravaged by weeks of guilt and sleepless nights. "Mom, can we—" "Not here," I said quietly. "Not now." "When?" "It's been 6 weeks since we've really talked. I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain." I gathered my purse and coat, feeling suddenly exhausted. "You married a criminal. You believed her lies over your mother's concerns. You let her steal from your family. What explanation could possibly matter now? I love you. The words came out broken, desperate. I know I failed you, but I love you. I looked at my son, really looked at him for the first time since this nightmare began. He'd lost weight, aged years and weeks. His marriage was over, his financial future uncertain, his relationship with his mother destroyed. He was paying a price for his choices, just as I'd paid for mine. I know you do, I said gently, but love without wisdom is dangerous. Love without boundaries is destructive. I loved you enough to trust your judgment about Cynthia, and look where that led us. So, that's it? You're writing me off forever? I'm protecting myself. Something I should have done years ago. I walked away from him then, down the courthouse steps and into the autumn sunshine that felt warmer than it had in weeks. Janet Peterson caught up with me at my car, her face glowing with satisfaction. "How does it feel?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. Like justice. Not satisfaction, not revenge, just justice. And now? Now came the hardest part. Learning to live with the choices I'd made, the boundaries I'd set, the family I'd lost in order to save myself. Now I go home, I said. To my house, to my life, to my future. Alone, but free. As I drove away from the courthouse, I didn't look back to see if Alan was still standing on the steps. That part of my life was over. The woman who'd sacrificed her peace of mind for family harmony was gone, replaced by someone who understood that self-preservation wasn't selfish, it was survival. 3 months later, I stood on the deck of my lake house, watching the first snow of winter dust, the pine trees that had sheltered 3 generations of my family. The coffee in my hands steamed in the cold air, and for the first time in years, I felt completely, utterly at peace. The legal proceedings had concluded faster than anyone expected. Cynthia's cooperation with federal investigators had expedited the property transfer, and by November, the young family who'd been renting had moved out with full compensation and genuine apologies for the confusion. They'd left the house cleaner than they'd found it, as if trying to erase any trace of the crime that had brought them there. I'd moved in permanently 2 weeks ago, selling my house in town to a young couple who reminded me painfully of Alan and myself 30 years earlier. The proceeds, combined with Cynthia's restitution payments, had given me more financial security than I'd enjoyed since my husband's death. Ironic that my daughter-in-law's crime had ultimately improved my circumstances. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter, as it had for weeks now. Alan's calls had gradually decreased from daily to weekly to nothing at all. I'd heard through Janet Peterson, who'd become an unexpected friend, that he'd sold the house he'd shared with Cynthia and moved to an apartment across town. He was working overtime to pay legal fees and trying to rebuild a life that no longer included either his wife or his mother. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I felt something that might have been guilt about his isolation. But guilt was a luxury I could no longer afford. I'd spent too many years sacrificing my judgment for other people's comfort, and the price had nearly destroyed me. The sound of a car on the gravel driveway interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone. Janet wasn't due until next week, and my few remaining friends knew I preferred advance notice. Through the window, I watched an unfamiliar sedan park next to my car. The woman who emerged looked to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair and a face that seemed vaguely familiar. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone approaching a difficult conversation, and my instincts, sharpened by recent experience, immediately went on alert. I opened the door before she could knock, studying her features and trying to place where I might have seen her before. "Mrs. Larson? Judith Larson?" "Yes, and you are?" "My name is Lucille Mitchell. I was Lucille Larson until about 8 years ago." She paused, gathering courage for whatever she'd come to say. "Cynthia is my older sister." The words hit like ice water. I gripped the doorframe, studying this woman who shared genetic material with the person who'd nearly destroyed my life. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same calculating intelligence in her eyes, though tempered by something that looked like genuine remorse. "What do you want?" "To apologize, and to return something that belongs to you." Against my better judgment, I stepped aside to let her enter. She moved through my living room with the same careful assessment I'd seen in Cynthia, but where my former daughter-in-law had evaluated everything for potential exploitation, Lucille seemed to be cataloging the damage her sister had caused. "I didn't know," she said without preamble, "about what she did to you, to your family. I didn't know until the FBI contacted me 3 months ago." "The FBI?" "Cynthia's part of a federal investigation now. They've connected her to at least 12 other cases across 4 states. Elderly victims, family members, anyone with assets she could access through trust or marriage." Lucille's voice was steady, but I caught the tremor of shame beneath her composure. "They wanted to know if I'd been aware of her activities." I gestured toward the sofa, suddenly needing to sit down. "And had you been?" "No, but I should have been." Lucille remained standing, too agitated for comfort. "I've been estranged from Cynthia for 8 years, ever since she tried to steal my inheritance when our grandmother died. I thought that was an isolated incident, desperation after her first divorce. I never imagined she'd made it her profession. The similarities between our stories weren't lost on me. Your inheritance? $50,000 and some jewelry. Not enough to retire on, but significant to me at the time. Cynthia forged documents to claim she was the sole beneficiary, then tried to gaslight me into believing I'd misremembered our grandmother's wishes." Lucille's laugh was bitter. "I was 23 and trusted my sister. It took 6 months to prove the forgery and get my money back." "But you never reported it." "No, she was family. I thought cutting contact was enough." Lucille finally sat down, her composure cracking slightly. "I've spent 8 years wondering if I could have prevented what happened to other people if I'd pressed charges then. I studied this woman who carried the burden of her sister's crimes in her conscience." "Why are you here, Lucille?" She reached into her purse and withdrew a small jewelry box, antique silver with delicate engravings that spoke of previous generations. "This belonged to your mother-in-law. Cynthia stole it from your house during one of her visits, probably months before she took the lake house. The FBI recovered it from a pawn shop in Chicago." My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was my mother-in-law's engagement ring, a modest but beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. I'd searched for it after the funeral, devastated by its disappearance, but assuming I'd misplaced it in my grief. "How did you know it was mine?" "The FBI showed me photos of everything they'd recovered from various pawn shops and fences. I recognized it from your wedding album. Alan showed me photos when he and Cynthia first started dating. I told them it belonged to you." I held the ring up to the light, watching the sapphire catch the winter sun streaming through my windows. This small piece of jewelry represented more than monetary value. It was a connection to my husband's family, to the woman who'd welcomed me as a daughter and treated me with the respect Cynthia had never shown. "There's more," Lucille continued quietly. "The FBI thinks Cynthia targeted your family specifically because of this house. She researched property values, identified elderly owners with trusting family members, then inserted herself into their lives through dating or marriage. Your son wasn't her first mark, just her most successful one." The words should have shocked me, but they didn't. After months of learning about Cynthia's systematic exploitation, nothing she'd done could surprise me anymore. What did surprise me was the relief I felt. Relief that Alan's victimization was complete, that he bore no responsibility for bringing a predator into our lives. "Is Alan aware of this?" "The FBI briefed him last week. He knows he was as much a victim as you were." Lucille hesitated, then continued. "He also knows about your mother-in-law's ring. He asked me to return it personally, to tell you how sorry he is for everything that happened." I slipped the ring onto my right hand, where it fit perfectly despite the years since I'd last worn it. "And what did you tell him?" "That sorry doesn't undo the damage. That forgiveness has to be earned, not demanded." Lucille stood again, moving toward the door. "But I also told him that cutting him out of your life completely might be punishing yourself as much as him." "Is that what you think?" "I think Cynthia destroyed enough relationships. I think she'd be satisfied knowing that her crimes continue to isolate people from their families even after she's in prison." Lucille paused at the threshold. "But that's just my opinion. You're the only one who can decide what your peace looks like." After she left, I sat in my living room holding my mother-in-law's ring and thinking about the strange twists that had brought me to this moment. Cynthia was in federal prison, facing additional charges that would likely keep her incarcerated for decades. Alan was alone in an apartment across town, paying for crimes he'd unknowingly enabled. And I was here, in the house that had always been my sanctuary, finally free from the fear and confusion that had plagued me for years. My phone buzzed with a text message. Alan's name appeared on the screen, and for the first time in months, I didn't delete the message without reading it. Mom, Lucille Mitchell told me she returned grandmother's ring. I'm glad you have it back. I know this doesn't change anything, but I want you to know that I understand why you can't forgive me. I'm not asking for another chance. I just want you to be happy. I read the message 3 times, searching for manipulation or hidden agenda. But the words seemed genuine. Not a plea for reconciliation, but an acknowledgement of consequences and a wish for my well-being that asked nothing in return. I typed back slowly, I am happy. Finally. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an invitation to rebuild our relationship, but it was honesty, and perhaps that was enough for now. As evening approached, I made dinner in the kitchen where my grandmother had taught me to cook, where my mother had passed down family recipes, where I'd fed 3 generations of relatives who'd gathered at this house for holidays and celebrations. The continuity felt sacred, not just of place, but of purpose. Cynthia had tried to steal this from me, to reduce my family's legacy to a gambling stake in her personal destruction. But she'd failed. The house remained, the memories remained, and I remained. Stronger, wiser, and infinitely more protective of what mattered most. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the lake in pristine white that reflected the lights from my windows. I'd survived the worst betrayal of my life and emerged with my dignity intact, my future secure, and my judgment restored. Some might call it justice. I called it inheritance, not the material kind that could be stolen or forged away, but the deeper legacy of strength and resilience that no criminal could touch. In the end, that inheritance proved to be worth more than any property Cynthia could have stolen. It was the one thing she'd never understand, never target, and never take away. It was the knowledge that I was enough, alone and unafraid, in the home where I belonged.